Good morning, good evening, good day. Welcome to Skeptic Haven's Global Atheist Show, where we explore ideas, we challenge beliefs, and we uncover the fascinating threads that weave through human history, culture, spirituality, etc. So tonight we're going to delve into one of the most enduring and enigmatic motifs in religion and mythology, and this is this concept of dying and rising gods. You'll find them throughout cultures all over the world, throughout history. People tell these stories of deities who face death only to return back to life. Osiris in ancient Egypt, Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Adonis and Dionysus in Greek mythology, Balder in the Norse legends. All of these gods embody the cyclical nature of life and death. They represent the changing seasons, renewal of the earth, and perhaps humanity's deepest desire for hope and redemption. Now, in Christianity, the story of Jesus as a dying and rising savior brought this motive to a new theological framework, offering spiritual renewal and salvation. But this story is the story unique, I mean to ask, or does it echo the myths that came before it? Are these tales of death and resurrection simply reflections of agricultural cycles? Or do they point to something deeper about the human condition, which is our fears, hopes, and our quest for meaning in a universe that often feels indifferent? Tonight, we're going to explore these questions and more with our guest, who brings expertise from theology, mythology, and beyond. Together, we'll examine what these myths tell us about the societies that created them and why they continue to captivate us today. The concept of dying and rising gods is a recurring theme in comparative religion and mythology, referring to deities who experience death and then return to life. Now, these myths are so pervasive that I think we should dive straight into it and get the show on the road. Good evening, gentlemen. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our panel, and we are going to go around clockwise, starting with you, Dr. Trsitan Kapp. If you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll go on to David and lastly, John.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Tristan Kapp. I am a researcher in comparative religion and esotericism from the University of Pretoria Department of Religion Studies. I am also a spokesperson and interfaith officer for the South African Pagan Rights Alliance, and also known in my personal capacity as the Friendly Satanist on social media.
David?
Hi, I'm Dave Fitzgerald. I'm probably best known as the author of Nailed, 10 Christian Myths that Show Jesus Never Existed at All, Jesus Mything in Action, and Playing God, An Evolutionary History of World Religion.
Amazing. John?
I'm John Gleason, the Godless engineer, and I just produce content on social media centered around, Christian origins and atheism in general.
Nice. So, where did you, this is such a fascinating topic. When I started looking into putting together the show, I obviously did a bit of research, and the gods just fell out of the cupboard. I mean, there's enough of them. You can't lift a rock without finding a dying and rising god, it seems. And then,
miracle.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, there's a recurring pattern. There's an archetype. There's an archetype of a dying and rising god. So firstly, there's obviously the process of death, where the god undergoes a form of death, be it physical, spiritual, metaphorical. And this usually involves a process of them dying and going into the the afterworld or underworld, or however. Then there is the process of resurrection or renewal, where this god returns to life and symbolizes a triumph over death, renewal, or restoration. And a lot of people have linked this with symbolic themes. People are always going, well, that can't be literal, like that can't be literal. Then he didn't really just like die and come back to God. And let's pause for a second here just to ask this question: gods that die, you have to put a full stop and a pause after that sentence, to let the impact of that just sink in for a second. These are supposed to be the most powerful creatures known to humanity, who affect, literally the puppet masters playing the strings. Yet they are so mortal, and it shows the human origin of these gods, the fact that they experience these human emotions and they go through the natural cycles of life. But the recurring themes, as I can tell, goes, it's either an agricultural cycle, when seeds are planted, when seeds are harvested, that cycle gets, especially in the Middle Eastern, like the Sumerian, those kind of gods were very much involved with agriculture. And then you also have cosmic renewal, where the world gets renewed. That features quite heavily in the Eastern side of religion. And then Christianity's favorite, spiritual redemption, atonement for sins, and the promise of eternal life. But I've been going on for a while. I'm very interested to hear, what your thoughts are on this. And, if you want to discuss any notable examples, if something pops to mind, that'll also be amazing.
If I may, if nobody wants to go first, I just want to introduce something that I recently now thought about as when you got into this discussion of that gods are seemingly immortal. I think it was Nietzsche who introduced this idea of in his the Parable of the Madman, where the Parable of the Madman runs into the square and basically asks the individuals, where is God? And then he enters into this whole existential crisis of where he basically says, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And he says, in that entire anecdote, he says, gods too decompose. And I think that is especially relevant to kick off this discussion, a little bit of philosophy.
Yeah. Just to piggyback on that, they also evolve, and the origins of the gods is different, and the development of gods, like all those beliefs that we're talking about now, those are the results of evolution after millennia. But in the beginning, they weren't necessarily all powerful or omnibenevolent or moral paragons, and people didn't worship them. They just, the sun, that's a big thing in the sky, and it's bigger than we are. And it's interesting to see how, from the dawn of time, the way people look at the world around them and say these are gods, what gods are, and how we interact with them. Here's a guy who says he can talk to the gods. Here's a guy who not only can talk to gods, but he's descended from the gods, and he rules us all now. And how the gods love everybody. At first, they just love you, your tribe. You're the only people in the world, but the only humans. But as you get bigger and bigger, and more families come in, and then you get other cultures in, and you get these cosmopolitan empires, gods get bigger and more transcendent and more omni everything. And it's just fascinating to watch the evolutionary process of that.
Right. Do you think this is a result of people challenging it and say, like, well, like, your God can't give me a hangnail.
Conan, all of a sudden, my God's a sky god. He shits on your little God.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. It also reminds me of, I don't know who you are. I mean, I probably am speaking to a very cultured audience and friends in the sense of that. I don't know if you're familiar with that, The Life of Brian from Monty Python, where there's basically, and I find it quite an accurate depiction of how religion evolved, or actually at least how the popularity of religion has spread, in terms of what you said, David, of the individuals basically saying that my God is the best and all of that. It's similar to politics. One guy has his platform, has his soapbox, or he's shouting to his audience, and Then there's next to him another guy who's shouting to his audience, and everybody, it basically just explains the whole process of oral traditions. And I think what is important to note as a sort of a prefix into this whole discussion of the evolution of religion, especially in terms of God's dying and resurrecting, we need to take into account that there is a common thing or a common theme, as Dr. Richard Carrier explained it in an article which he wrote. I can't remember. I think it was in 2018. He wrote the article, God's resurrecting is pagan. Get over it, or something like that is the title. Right. And what I gathered from his perspective is that he referred to a mytheme, which is a common theme in the mythos of all the origins of religions, in terms of the entirety of the idea of even God's dying and resurrecting is a sort of it's an anthropomorphic characteristic. You see that anthropomorphic idea, and for those of you who don't know Greek, the anthropomorphic term basically derives from the Greek anthropos and morphe, which basically refers to the individual God taking on a human persona or a human characteristics. You'll see in the Bible, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, you'll see Yahweh exhibiting human emotions or human characteristics. The same with these gods. Except within the pagan religions, you'll see a different form of anthropomorphism where these gods not only exhibit human characteristics, but essentially display in their entirety of their existence a sort of human characteristic, including, the god Dionysus, for example, the god of wine and the god of partying and festivities and all of that. So gods were also known as very debaucherous. Even, Osiris, in ancient Egypt, the Egyptians were exceptionally fascinating, and the entirety of Osiris, especially resurrecting and dying as a focus, being dismembered by Seth, his brother, and then being reassembled by Isis. There's somewhat of a scholarly debate on whether he was actually bodily resurrected or whether he was not bodily resurrected. However, some pyramid texts suggest, or pre-Christian pyramid texts or inscriptions suggest, that he was bodily resurrected. But nonetheless, the entirety of this idea of God's dying and resurrecting is a very anthropomorphic characteristic being projected on these gods, in essence, to make them, in a word, humanesque to a certain extent, to make them more relatable, because they were debaucherous. They slept with women. I mean, even I think it was Herodotus that wrote an exceptional exposition on the Osiride and Isaiah, or something like that, on Osiris and Isis, where he basically describes the antics of Isis and Osiris, who are basically considered as the main pantheon deities in Egypt, which basically, in certain contexts are considered the head of the pantheon. Of the pantheon.
And meanwhile, Heraclitus, I think it was, said, if lions could have their gods, if horses had their gods, they'd
be horses.
Like them. Yeah.
Well, and I know that there is some kind of connection between these dying and rising gods and the changing of the seasons, right? Like there's a deep connection there in explaining like why the seasons change and why crops die and why they rebloom and everything like that. So, I mean, I think that there's like a lot of different connections that you can make there with that.
Like for example, Tammuz, the Mesopotamian deity, is a vegetation deity.
Yeah.
Dies annually, is mourned by his lover, which is Anana Ishtar, and then she goes to the underworld to rescue him, and it's a representation of the agricultural cycles. The funny thing is I can visualize this. I can visualize the ancient human being standing, shaking his fist at the sky, going like, "Why no rain? Why no rain? No food?" And then,
it's funny you mentioned Tammuz, because the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament itself complains that the women in the Jerusalem temple are worshiping Tammuz while the guys are worshiping the sun in the Jerusalem temple itself. Yeah.
Dean, I also wanted to add what David said there. What I think we should also distinguish is that the entire death and resurrection thing, and God's dying and resurrection, we should also understand that the changing of seasons and all of that, and the crops essentially, is only one part of the definition or understanding or framework through which scholars interpret the entire resurrection thing, death and resurrection thing. You've got the euhemerist framework, which is basically a framework for understanding. I think it's borrowed from the philosopher Euhemerus, who argued that these gods were essentially ancestors, who basically got immortalized through oral traditions and then later on became gods, such as what we see. As what we see with Hercules and especially Tammuz. Although, if I'm not mistaken, Tammuz is also associated or misconceived or confused with, or even associated or equated in numerous traditions with a Greek god. I think it's Asclepius, if I'm not mistaken. I'm speaking under correction. I think it's something with an A. Although despite that, the entire thing of the naturalist versus the euhemerist interpretation is that these are the main departure points that the book in 1980. I think you also mentioned it in your notes, Dean, that you sent to us. I can't remember his name now. The book in 1980. I can't remember the name now. But anyway, about the entire resurrection of deities. But also the interesting thing is that most people do not understand, that most people do not know, is that Inanna is also associated with Venus and the bright morning star, and that is where the idea of Lucifer or the Hallel ben Shachar in Hebrew comes from, is closely associated with Inanna and visiting her lover in the underworld.
Yeah. So.
Right. And then I am fascinated by Norse mythology. And they also feature this theme. Where, for example, I believe it's Balder. Never. I always thought of Odin. Yeah, that's about.
Yeah, the Havamal actually mentions Odin actually sacrificing himself on Yggdrasil and being, severed with this. Yggdrasil, the tree of life. Or from whence all creation comes from in Norse mythology, essentially, and was also pierced with a spear in his side, and then essentially he grew and then resurrected as a more powerful version of himself, according to the legends or the myth, essentially.
You can see the cross-pollination back and forth.
Absolutely, and there's actually a term for it. It's called syncretism. So the entire concept of these death and resurrection motif, or myth theme, as Dr. Carrier refers to it, is essentially a product of syncretism as such, in the sense of they all have a sort of a common motif or a common theme, essentially, in all of these religions. For example, they all have some savior god. They all have an idea of the god, or at least not all of them collectively have these attributes or these these themes rather, but some of them have themes of they are cultisms or cults that involve baptism, that involve a sort of joining, that involve a sort of group mentality, as you mentioned earlier, David. So the entire concept of it is not foreign, and it's not new to Christianity, and even most scholars of religion would agree that the entirety of Judaism and the concept of the Messiah is essentially a latecomer to the entire concept of God's dying and resurrection. Even Inanna, whom you mentioned earlier, was I think she was nailed to a nail or something and was left there for.
Yeah, she was hung up in chains or something.
She was hung up against a nail for about 9 days or something. Which was quite fascinating to me when I read that. That was
I thought it was actually 3 days for her in her case. But
Yeah, there's I think so, yes, but I think that was Osiris because of the fact that he died on the 17th of I can't remember the specific month or the chronology of it. These specifics elude me. So please, if anybody knows the specifics, please correct me. But yes.
But you're right. They start sounding a lot alike. And
and he was also on the moon. It was very closely associated with the lunar calendar, which was also something that formed a part of the ancient Judaic character or calendar, essentially. So that was something that I found fascinating. But I think it was Inanna who was 9 days, if I'm not mistaken, and Osiris was 3 days or 3 years. But I'm completely under correction.
I think she was hung on a hook, I think, if I remember.
Yes.
All the details are always different, and Christians always say, "Oh, well, no, this is completely different. This is completely different. This is not this." It's like everything is different. Mormonism is different from Baptism. It's ripped off from each other, if they're not exactly identical, no, it couldn't possibly have any relation whatsoever. and then in the meantime, you've got ancient writers like Justin Martyr saying, "Oh, when we say this about our God, it's the same thing you guys are saying about your God." And
it's ironic because even Plutarch wrote about some of these gods essentially rising. I think it was especially Osiris, and he used the Greek word anabiosis. Palagenesia is the Greek that he used in the terms of the fact that Osiris had a bodily resurrection, and he also wrote against early critic of Christianity, beginning with a C.
Celsus?
Celsus,
yes, Celsus, exactly. Thank you. Where he basically wrote against Celsus about Osiris's bodily resurrection, sort of having a sort of similarity to the Christian resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, and Firmicus Maternus actually went out and said, "Oh, it's so obvious that Satan read the prophecies in the Old Testament, saw Christianity, and so he started all this fake Christianity." It's like, God's a deadbeat dad, but he's Johnny on the spot all the time, 24/7.
Yeah, Satan created all of these religions to confuse Christians.
Yep.
Just like the dinosaur bones.
Yep, exactly. C.S. Lewis, when we say Christianity was myth made flesh, it's like, are you listening to what you're saying, C.S. Come on.
Am I the only person on this planet that reads Celsus's works in the tone of a sarcastic 14-year-old atheist?
What's great is people like Celsus and Porphyry. These second century guys, their criticisms still hold up. They still hold up. They're just as
valid as fuck. You read it, you just go like
2,000 years ago. Yeah.
But I'm interested in hearing your guys' perspective on the idea of the Christian resurrection, because I think this is perhaps I think the climax of what this entire discussion leads up to as a sort of a main theme to cross reference all of that, because there's a lot of individuals who might say that Christ has a bodily resurrection, and that the empty tomb is proof of Jesus' salvific resurrection and death, and a lot of Pauline theology don't distinguish these things as separate events. But I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts about.
Pauline doesn't use that argument at all. He doesn't say, "Oh, you can go see the empty tomb." He taught everything for his Christ is happening up in heaven. And he's a secret agent savior deity that no one would know about, a secret locked in heaven, if it weren't for preachers like him. That's something that blows my mind.
I'm of the opinion with this whole resurrection and empty tomb nonsense. I'm just saying those guys were invested in this story. Like if I was them, I'd also go and hide the body. Look over there.
Look over there. Any of these gospels make sense, even on any level. They're so purely allegorical, and the plot holes are all right there, but they disappear when you realize, oh, well, that's just an allegory. He didn't really get mad at a fig tree, even though figs were out of season. That's an allegory for Judaism. The whole Barabbas thing. They didn't really release a murderer instead of this guy they were cheerleading for. 20 minutes ago. It's because it's all for Yom Kippur. It's an allegory for Yom Kippur. What do you think?
I think it's
talking a lot. Wait, I haven't heard much from you, John.
Well, yeah. So the I think that as far as the dying and rising God motif relates to like Christian origins and everything like that, I think that it's incredibly naive to think that Christianity is the one special religion that breaks the motif and is the one real time somebody did resurrect from the dead, and to have such a well-established motif, like especially in the Mediterranean area, and say that, oh yeah, that didn't affect them at all. I feel like that's being very naive about how religions develop. Especially when you go comparing, like, especially what Christianity turned into eventually to what mystery religions are. I think you'll see like a lot of the same things there, a lot of the frameworks, that make up mystery religions. And then if you pile on top of that the evidence from Paul speaking of Christianity in a very mystery religion laden sort of vocabulary, I think that it becomes very clear that mystery religions played a significant role in the development of Christianity prior to, it getting to Paul, but also Paul further developed that whole idea.
It's actually fascinating that you should mention that, John, because there's a scholar, Elrene Pagels, who wrote significant scholarship on Paul, on the Pauline epistles, who argued that even though Paul was a vociferous critic of the Gnostics, and some of the ascetics, essentially, he was a very, vehement Gnostic himself. And some of them, or at least in my humble opinion, I'm no New Testament scholar, but I would reason that there's a lot of themes that one can find within Pauline epistemology that one can associate with early Gnosticism, especially because of the fact that he was influenced by early Gnostic literature in and of itself, or not him directly, rather the scribes that wrote or authored some of his epistles, because of the fact that some of the epistles are not necessarily ascribed or not necessarily authored by Paul. The Deuteronomy and Trito Pauline.
We call them forgeries. Theologians have a different word for it, but yeah.
There's the Deutero and Trito Pauline literature, which is questionable authorship of Paul.
Yeah. To put it lightly.
Yeah. Put it lightly.
Like, in scholarly circles, it's not even controversial to say, "Oh yeah, clearly he didn't write Titus and."
It's
not that.
Pseudoepigraphy was a very popular. Approach to writing things, or ascribing a sort of popular name to a certain text to give it more credibility. It was a sort of a publicity stunt.
Exactly, and it's very interesting to see the apologists spin that and say, "Oh no, it was a honor. It was totally accepted." It's like, no, it wasn't.
Exactly.
Forgery and counter-forgery in Christianity. It's like, no, they hated it just as much as we did.
Precisely. All of these myths that we have today are essentially ancient. I'd say remnants of what we can understand as sort of journalism. Yeah. You've got certain perspectives, and nobody would know who's Bob, who's Bob, or even Brian. Let's use a more what do you call it? A more tongue-in-cheek an analogy, and saying that nobody knew who was Brian who wrote this. Nobody, if you called it the Gospel of Brian, nobody would know what you're talking about. But if you called it the Gospel of Matthew or Mark, well, Matthew and Mark were quite popular or rather seen figures in the ancient Near East in terms of Christianity, early Christianity, as far as Jesus is concerned. As such, they're quite authorities and therefore represent a sort of credibility. And the same with all of these other texts, essentially.
Right. And again, it's important to realize those weren't the original titles. It wasn't originally
precisely
according to that guy. And none of them were writing it. They were all setting out to write the one true gospel.
Yes.
In the late 1st century, if we're lucky, early 2nd century, probably more like. And all the other ones, it didn't make the cut. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the thing, David. I want to be the fly on the wall at that council where somebody's like, that's good.
And
this is too far out.
This about it. Like, this bishop brought in all his thugs and dominated this council or that council. Here's another thing. It's like, let's say we had not a forgery, but an actual Pauline letter. He put it in a vault and we just discovered it now. We would have no way of knowing that that's the original Pauline letter. We just, here's another interesting variant of Paul. For the first 150 to 200 years, we have nothing. We don't even have fragments of anything from the New Testament. And as soon as we do start getting fragments and complete books of the epistles and New Testament, we get variants, and not just mistakes in grammar or spelling or scribal errors, but deliberate changes of something to mean the opposite of what it says in some other text. And again, Bart Ehrman's his orthodox corruption of scripture, his forgery and counter-forgery in Christianity, he describes how forgery and this kind of scribal edit wars, that was one of the hallmarks of early Christianity. That was one thing that stands out about early Christianity, is the degree to which their scriptures are forged.
Speaking of Dr. Ehrman, he was one of the scholars that espoused that Osiris didn't have a bodily resurrection, with which Josh Carrier, Dr. Josh Carrier, Richard Carrier vociferously disagreed with in terms of the Permit text. Something just I thought about now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Ehrman has actually, not on that particular topic, but on a number of other topics, Ehrman's actually come around on. He's flipped position from earlier in like when he was writing "Did Jesus Exist?" and everything like that, and then his later novels or his later writings have overturned a number of his conclusions. Like, I believe it was how Paul thought of Jesus. Was one of them. Like Paul, like he admits later in a later writing that Paul thought of Jesus as a celestial angel first. That he then co-opts it to be like, but he thought that he was a real person on earth. He just thought he initially started out as a celestial angel kind of thing. And so you have Ehrman like flipping on those things, and I just wonder how long it's going to be until Ehrman flips on like the commonalities between mystery cults, especially in the Mediterranean mystery cults, how close they are in comparison to Christianity.
Well, I think there is significant scholarship on that already existing, especially when referring to the Manichaeans, who were a sort of a mystery cult in early Christianity. But once again,
you can't just tease. Like,
no.
what are you talking about?
So the Manichaeans were, if I'm not mistaken, again, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but from my master's studies in theology, I can remember somewhat, especially Irene Pagels speaking about it, about the Manichaeans, who were, I think they were a Roman Gnostic cult who believed they worshipped, or rather centraled around this cult of this guy called Mani, who was a sort of a centrifugal figure in this whole cult, who believed in a narrative of that the soul was trapped in the body as a sort of as a divine seed that was trapped in the human body, and that needs to be freed from via, I think it was asceticism. So basically just devoting oneself to the spiritual and absolutely devoting oneself to a stoical lifestyle, in essence. So most people would think that the asceticism in early Christianity would come from the early church fathers, whereas it was actually influenced by early Stoic philosophy. Because of the fact that they had this entire idea of what a superior or a supreme individual had to do. And that's what the Manichaeans essentially emulated. But they were a very prominent cult, which Paul criticized vehemently. And it's quite interesting that we speak about Paul because of the fact that Paul's entire theology, in essence, is based on the resurrection of Jesus. His entire raison d'etre in the New Testament of the basis of Christianity, in every single of his epistles, he refers concurrently to the resurrection of Jesus, which is quite ironic and interesting to begin with.
You know what's ironic, doubly ironic about that is he says things like, well, the Greeks look for wisdom and wise teachings. The Jews look for miracles, but we don't have any of that. We just teach Christ crucified. And it's like, boom. You know, when you hear him say things like that, it's really hard to think, you know, or when you
fuck all that knowledge. We got magic.
Yeah, it's like, but don't you have that too? I mean, we read it in your books. It's like, and, you know, that all came after Paul, way after Paul. Yeah. There's another guy, 2nd century, another heretic, Marcion. We would probably not have our New Testament if he hadn't put together his first and sent up this theological Sputnik called the Apostolon, which was his gatherings. We probably wouldn't even know about Paul at all because clearly Marcion really liked Paul. And nobody else seems to have during his lifetime. And it's so weird, no matter how you slice it, even if Christianity was true, it's very weird that we have one guy for like the whole 1st century of Christianity, and that's about all we hear from is one dude.
But I think this was due to the Western influence. But what's even crazier in my preparation for this discussion, I came across the story of Dionysus, I think. This was whack. I mean, honestly, this was whack. He got born through the womb of a woman. So he was dismembered as a baby. That's hectic to begin with, honestly. Dismembered as a baby. And then the gods basically, I don't know if they put him in a blender or something, because somehow he found himself in a smoothie that was drunk by a woman, and then he was basically burst through that womb of a woman. So he got born as a god, got dismembered, turned into a smoothie, and then got born as a demigod out of the womb of a human woman.
It's so crazy. It has to be true.
Right?
No, listen. That would just be embarrassing, okay? To say that you got made into a smoothie and then drank your Lord and Savior. You know, I mean, it's just embarrassing, guys. It's got to be fun.
I mean, you have to give credit to these ancient writers. I mean, they really had a phenomenal way of putting things. I mean, how do you even think of that? Is it just a language thing of them just, using their own language to describe these things, or is it just them having a very vivid imagination?
Honestly, I think it has something to do. I think it has something to do with the fact that they don't like sex. And it's like, oh no, our God didn't have sex. Oh no, he was born because this ray of light hit this woman, or this swan impregnated. It's like, yeah, but people having sex, like, oh no. And I think it all comes back to that ascetic thing as well.
Yeah.
That's why we have virgin births. And,
But you mentioning the virgin births is actually also interesting, because the entire resurrecting and death of gods is very closely connected with the concept of immaculate conception.
Yeah.
And I read the other day, interestingly enough, Persephone was even one of these deities that was birthed through the goddess Nyx, the goddess of night, who gave birth to Persephone, because Persephone and Aphrodite basically battled with Adonis, who was essentially one of these gods. I think that's the god that I mentioned earlier that is often confused with Tammuz, is Adonis. In the sense of that Adonis was one of the gods mentioned that is essentially also sometimes that also died and resurrected, but some accounts believe that he wasn't really physically resurrected. He died or something, and he got turned into a flower or something. But essentially, back to the entirety of how Persephone and Aphrodite is connected is the fact that they fought between who basically could have Adonis, or who had Adonis, or who could see Adonis when he was an infant. Yeah. So the gods agreed that Adonis would spend time with Persephone in the underworld, and Aphrodite in Olympus, essentially. But what was the point that I was trying? Oh, the Immaculate Conception. So Persephone was one of the goddesses that was immaculately conceived without a male partner, with Nyx, the goddess of night from ancient Greece, which is quite interesting as to how these themes commonly intertwine with one another.
You also see in Eastern religion too, with the Buddha, Mahavira.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Although the Buddhist religions, there are instances in the Eastern religions where there are sages. There's a princess in, I think, early Buddhism who is believed to have also had this idea of death and resurrection, although the entire concept of death and resurrection, the Atman, the Brahman, and the Moksha, and all of that in the Hindu tradition is more to do with a non-corporeal, as John spoke earlier about the mystery religion, is more topical, or the esoteric idea of resurrection and death is more a metaphorical instance, not necessarily a corporeal resurrection, as we can see in some of these myths discussed thus far.
Well,
but
let me jump in real fast, because one thing about that is I think there was a debate going on in early Christianity about, are we talking just a spiritual? Because you have letters from Paul saying, how is some of you Christians saying there's no such thing as physical resurrection, And,
absolutely.
And there's definitely, when you see Luke, he says, Jesus comes back and he wants to eat a fish, touch my hands,
Yeah.
If
so
that said, no, this was all just allegorical or spiritual, or someone said, no, he really did.
So that's a very interesting point you made, David. Did you want to say something, John?
Oh, yeah. I was just going to add that we also have to take into consideration how first century Jews and Jewish Christians thought of, physicality, I guess, or what it means to be corporeal, because they, like Paul, would have considered the beings that were in the lower parts of the heavens, like right there at the firmament. He would consider them to be corporeal, so like flesh and blood. They were just of a more celestial flesh and blood kind of situation. So like to say that he wouldn't have thought of a bodily resurrection, I think that he did think of a bodily resurrection, but that doesn't rule out a celestial or spiritual nature to this sort of resurrection that Paul thought of. And I think that right there is kind of what really obfuscates, like whenever we read Paul or read these early first century Christians, like what do they mean by this? And because they don't mean like ghosties like we think of now when we talk about spirituality. They think of a real physical place that you could go to, just like they thought that Hades or hell was a real physical place that you went to after you died. And heaven also was a real physical place that you could go to. So I think that we have to keep that in mind too when we're talking about like how physical was this resurrection.
And you know what? Let's get back to the idea of the mystery faiths, because I'm kind of glossing over, it feels like, but I think it's incontrovertible that Christianity is a Jewish version of the mystery faiths, and it evolved right out of those mystery faiths, which themselves evolved out of agricultural deities for the most part. But I can't underscore that enough, that when we're talking about Christianity, we are talking about a mystery faith, a mystery religion.
I think there are mystery elements. I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a mystery religion due to the fact that it's a very complex framework that we're dealing with in mystery, in terms of the fact that mystery is commonly considered as what one would call prisca theologica, or earliest theology, or the first proto-theology of ancient religion to a certain degree. I did my entire PhD thesis on esotericism, and therefore I disagree with the framework of classifying Christianity as a mystery faith, due to the fact that even though, yes, there are very spiritual elements, I would say that evangelical Christianity one could classify as a sort of a mystery-esque development, due to the fact that you've got very what do you call it, esoteric praxis, the idea of speaking at tongues, the idea of Pentecostalism, that entire, I'd say, branch of Christianity one can consider as a sort of a mystery cult, but or a mystery praxis. But I wouldn't consider the de facto Christianity as sort of mystery. The reason why I'm saying that is due to the fact that mystery is essentially a very nuanced esoteric classification, and it has a very specific set of characteristics in being connected to transpersonality, the idea of what's the term now. I completely forgot the word. The idea of being physical. There's a big mixture between the physical and the metaphysical. And even though there's that dualism in Christianity, I don't necessarily would classify it, therefore, as a dualistic, as a mystical faith, due to the fact that it doesn't necessarily resemble the similar tropes that one would find in Hermes Trismegistus' approach to mysticism, one of the early sages of the ancient Near East, Helena Blavatsky's theosophy. So there's a very, very fine line, I'd say.
This is interesting to me because I think you and I could have a really good
do
a whole show just on that nuance. That is
absolutely.
I would argue it's
fascinating.
all the boxes, absolutely. But it's I love when we can have a discussion like this and point out where this is the point where we disagree, and that's okay. You know?
Yeah, but it's a fruitful conversation, and I think we all come from the same sort of departure point. So it's not a criticism. I mean, I have a very, very small field of expertise, so I don't really know much of.
I would love to talk more about that to you offline.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, but yeah. Anyway, I'm curious, John, what you wanted to contribute?
Right. So like, I guess I would need to, maybe this is like what David was talking about, but I guess I would just need to understand like what you mean by a mystery religion and how Christianity's not, because like my understanding of mystery religion is that every mystery religion is unique in its theology, but it's not unique in its structure. And so that when we say that Christianity is and was a mystery religion, it's more about the structure of especially early Christianity. So I guess maybe I don't know if you could help me understand like how you define mystery religion, because like I said, everything that I've read about mystery religions, mystery cults and everything, it seems to be more about structure than specific beliefs.
So mystery is essentially referred or more connected to the individual or self-knowledge or the self, essentially. And it's focused on I think it's transpersonality of the idea of, for example, using the Buddha as an example. That's a very good example of a mystery religion. The idea of the Eightfold Path having the conclusion as a sort of an enlightenment, the Buddhahood. And in Hinduism, you've got moksha, which is the ultimate goal to work towards. But with Christianity, I'd say asceticism, even though asceticism does find itself in some mystery religions, the difference with Christianity is that Christianity is a de facto monotheistic monotheistic faith. In terms of that, it connects explicitly to a set of rules focused on the externality instead of the inward realm. So it has less to do with inward consciousness. It has less to do with the idea of being connected with a spiritual realm, influencing the individual per se, and forming a level of consciousness where there's a sort of a dualism or a line in which these two realms are integrated with one another. So there's a very strong dualism within Christianity that basically separates the spiritual from the physical as two different entities, and nary the two shall meet. For example, the idea that Jesus or God, essentially, or the angels are angelic. It's not necessarily that we ourselves are God, even though Jesus does mention in the New Testament that the kingdom of God resides within all of us. That is a mystical statement to make, which is very esoteric to begin with. But in essence, in and of itself, I don't find the demarcation for Christianity as necessarily mystical, due to the fact that it doesn't resemble the relationship with consciousness and ritualized consciousness and the idea of evolving oneself emotionally or spiritually is a sense in terms of, and we're speaking of clearly biblical Christianity as it was created by the early church fathers, not necessarily the modern schisms like Pentecostalism, which I would admit is a mystical cult in and of itself,
Can I jump in, Tristan, for just a second? I see where you're going. I think I see where we're passing each other in this conversation. Because when you talk about, for instance, Buddhism, and we talk about mysticism.
Oh, yes.
I'm totally getting what you're saying about that paradigm of that. But when we're talking about mystery faith in that Mediterranean context, we're talking about very specific thing.
Okay. Yes. You're right, David.
Yeah. And
thank you.
Yeah, no worries at all.
I for a moment completely misconstrued mystery for mysticism. So thank you for that correction, David. That's an important distinction to make.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's so easy. But when we're talking about theology, we're talking about nothings and degrees of nothings, and it's easy to mix up all this nothingness.
Yeah.
I don't have to tell a theologian that.
Well, I'm more a religion scholar and not necessarily a theologian, because theologians are Christian.
Someone who studied theology, and it's
it's essentially. But I don't think that the traditional model of theology is necessarily a reliable. Well, essentially, there was a philosopher I encountered the other day, which also espoused the de facto study of theology explicitly as far as it pertains to Christian theology, is very much to do with the study of nothingness.
Yeah. There's a great quote from Thomas Jefferson. It says, when we're talking about grace, when we're talking about all these things, we're talking about nothing. And I just, that's why he didn't want to have a department of theology in the university he founded, is because
interesting.
This is nothing built on nothings,
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So that's it. End of the day, folks. Religion is nonsense, and we're better off without it. Good night, everybody. Yay.
But this is actually a very I love to use this analogy where I once heard it said that religion is like the manufacturer of sausages. As soon as you know what the ingredients are and what goes into the final product, you very soon lose your taste for it altogether.
Yep.
However, sorry, Dean, continue.
No, I was done.
Oh, are you sure?
Yes.
I don't want to be rude. I apologize. It's my ADHD that sometimes kick in, so please don't take it personally if I interrupt you. I want to throw a spanner in the wheel because of the fact that I have a more, I wouldn't say optimistic point of view when it comes to religion, but rather when I did my PhD thesis, I explored. Sorry, David?
Appreciate the good that it provides in.
Not necessarily. The fact that I believe that myth making, and that's merely I appreciate the same way. I appreciate ancient religion myth the same way I appreciate J.R.R. Tolkien's the Silmarillion, or a science fiction, the Warhammer universe. I mean, I'm showing you guys what a big of a nerd I am.
You're right. You're one friend there, yeah.
So I find a religion as a form of storytelling, and also a sort of a proto-science. I mean, even if you look at ancient paganism and the idea of alchemy, which is something that preceded modern science. I mean, before we had the periodic table, we had the alchemic symbols, which is something that I'm quite fascinated by. So I do think that there has a relevance in terms of the fact that, and especially back to my thesis where I did a lot of the evolution of religion, going from animism, the worship of nature, as you mentioned earlier, David, and then concluding with post-theism as a sort of an after, drafting the chronology of a sort of a chronological evolution of religion, as you mentioned it. I did quite a deep exposition of that entire discussion. And what I found interesting enough is throughout the entire evolution of religion per se, and the evolution of the human cognitive ability to discern their surroundings, is the fact that religion essentially was a proto-scientific lens through which humanity interpreted their surroundings. I mean, especially with regards to the topic at hand, the idea of death and resurrection. I mean, there had to be a reason for why people died, and therefore there was the naturist explanation to associate with the turning of seasons, the dying of crops. I mean, even Halloween, the celebration of the dead is essentially where the dead come back, and humanity essentially celebrate the spirits coming back from the dead. Even the ancient Egyptians believed very strongly in the concept of the underworld, or the mummification process, and keeping the body preserved so that the spirit would come back and then come back to the body and inhabit it. So the common motif of death and resurrection was a sort of an idea to explain why people die and sort of create a narrative which made sense to the individuals. And thank heavens for science that we can understand that death is a natural part of life. I think it was Nietzsche who said the only thing absolute in life is death. So the entire concept of science obfuscated, along with the new atheist movement, and I would argue even Karl Marx and François-Marie Arouet, whose real name is Voltaire. Those philosophers who basically preempted the dawn of the Aufklärung, or the Enlightenment era, which was followed by the new atheist movement, Dawkins, Hitchens, and the lot, who basically created, along with science, that we have replaced these proto and indigenous cultural narratives of totems, of spiritism, of mystery, essentially with cold hard facts and cosmology and novel scientific expertise, which has essentially replaced science.
Isn't this something that James George Fraser also touched on in the
Golden Bough?
That we had these, that we are in this evolution of consciousness, and where we started off with these proto religions, and now we in the final stages of it, going through to scientific to the scientific part of our consciousness. But this is, this theme has sort of like started sneaking into pop culture, and in literature we find all these references to this, where people are drawing this comparison. That movie in 2007, Zeitgeist, that did a pretty good comparison of it. And then also, what was this recent? There was a recent series on TV where they also had these set of gods that were going through.
Was that with Jeff Goldblum, Chaos?
Yes.
Where it was the Greek myths as if they were happening right now with TV and cars and.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah.
I completely missed that.
Oh, it's on Netflix if you have access to that.
Oh,
it's a miniseries.
Okay.
But it's fascinating. Like in Superman, the Superman stories, you see these same archetype myth themes get reused. Superman comes back from the dead. All the superheroes come back from the dead. No superheroes stay dead.
Absolutely. Interestingly enough, the Egyptians had a very, very cool practice, which was very astonishing to me when I discovered it. So they had coffin spells. A guy did his entire PhD thesis on it. It was brilliant, very, very fascinating, where he basically combined this idea of death and rebirth, or resurrection, at least in terms of the afterlife in Egypt, but specifically with regards to the coffin spells. So what the Egyptians used to do is they would basically insert a little scroll with hieroglyphs, or demotic, as Proto-Egyptian, before the hieroglyphs were, similar to Arabic in terms of the demotic on the Rosetta Stone, for example, were included in that little scrolls and inserted with the mummy into the burial. And that would be a sort of spell, which scholars later compiled into an entire text of where individuals would provide certain luxuries to the individual in the afterlife for when they would be resurrected. For example, one specific instance would be for them to have a good sex life in the afterlife. So the Egyptians were very, very fond of sex and eroticism. And so they would basically, I think it was a bracelet that they would put on the arm of the mummy, along with a sort of an inscription that they would put in the coffin with the mummy. And that would obviously guarantee the mummy a good sex life in the afterlife, which was fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, so we are more or less nearing the end of our conversation.
Hectic, are we done already? I was just trying to enjoy it.
Yeah.
But fascinating as it's, I could listen to this shit for days, honestly. It's like, it fascinates me to no extent. But I was, in closing, I just wanted to ask you guys, if we had a scale where 0 is complete myth and 10 is...
it all really happened.
It really happened, right. So where would you place yourself on this mythicist scale, right?
In relation to Christianity or just religion?
Yeah. The whole bang shoot. The whole bang shoot.
Well, I mean, I'm right there with it's all bullshit. It's fascinating bullshit. It's amazing bullshit. But nonetheless, it is in fact bullshit. In the same way that the Silmarillion, Winnie the Pooh, any of these wonderful works of literature who give so much joy to our lives are bullshit, And when we recognize them as that and accept them and love them for that, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Fundamentalist.
Yeah. I find your perspective fascinating, David. In my point of view, I would consider I have a different interpretation as to the idea of myth in terms of literary terms, due to the fact that when I hear the term myth, I think of it as a sort of a genre of writing that is predominantly found in religion, similar to science fiction, similar to biography drama, biography fiction, whatever you want to call it, all of the fiction genres or the literary genres you can think of. And as such, I find the idea of religious myth to be fascinating in terms of it explained a way of thought that gives us access to ancient civilizations and the way they thought. That doesn't mean that the narratives are necessarily untrue. I think a lot of it is embellished. I think a lot of it is added a lot of bells and whistles. I think I am more of the humorist perspective, where I think they were humans. They were ordinary individuals. They were ancestors.
At the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, you quite prominently find that in some of the African traditions in South Africa, especially with the isiZulu, the isiXhosa, and the Isangoma tradition, where, for example, they have a very strong connection to ancestors. And I think a lot of religion and a lot of myth making is essentially ancestral veneration to a certain degree. I mean, even the Hebrew Bible refers back to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Moses and all of them. So essentially the deities and these gods, or rather these gods in and of themselves, quite possibly might have been ancestors. Not in the degree of the literal sense of how we understand ancestors, but rather how they form a part of a certain culture's history and development and oral traditions. And as we know with oral traditions, no same story comes out the same way. The similar when a Muslim, for example, came to me at some time and told me that the Quran is perfect in perfect form as it was conveyed by the Prophet, I told him that's absolute nonsense, because it's an ancient text. It was oral traditions, and there's no oral tradition. I mean, even this conversation, if someone were to relay this conversation to someone else, they would invariably interpret it throughout their own hermeneutical lens. And I think that is the point of where we should understand religious myth without removing it from its context and anachronistically imposing it on our context. I think keeping it in an ancient context and recognizing it was an ancient way of thinking. It was an ancient way of perhaps, I'm speaking completely as my humble anecdote, or my humble perspective rather, that these things are essentially connected to ancestors or a form of past history. That's no longer relevant, but it doesn't make it more wonderful.
So that would be a 2 on the scale of 1 to 10, 0 to 10.
Oh yeah, essentially.
John, where are you on the scale? 0 to 10.
On the scale of like 0 to full blown mythicist.
0. it's
0
not
being
true, 10
full-blown
it's all
mythicist
true.
and 10 being not.
Oh wait, sorry. Did I get the wrong number? Which
Scale inverted.
I'm sorry. What are the two ends again?
0, it's complete hogwash, made up,
okay.
fantasy, and on the other side of the scale, it's
All fiction.
from the heavens above through the ears of prophets onto paper.
Right.
All true. All true.
Right. Well, I would say that I'm as close to the it's all totally fiction as I can be, reasonably certain. I wouldn't say like a full blown on that end of it, because there's always a possibility, I guess.
Sure.
But I would say that the proclivity of religions being, not true, like not comporting with reality and all that other kind of stuff, and it being fictional made up stuff, all of that is highly more likely than anything else. So I would say that I'm as far as reasonably possible on the end of it's all complete fiction.
Dean, answering this question would be another hour-long show. Easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's very true, David.
I consider myself as well. I'm on that 0.5%. On the I'm so close to 0. You might as well call me a 0.
Well, here's the thing: I'll gladly change my 0 to something else if evidence warrants. And it's like, I don't mean to be mean by saying it's a 0. It's it is what it is.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
We can talk about the benefits and the downsides, but
the reason why I won't say like I'm 0.0 is because, like, sure, Jerusalem exists. That's in the book.
Well, Spider-Man is true because New York. Look at the incredible historical accuracy of
there is like a smidgen of truth to it.
This is the thing, and that whole conversation between, is this purely literary right out of the box, or is there a kernel of truth? That's an interesting conversation to have. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a fascinating conversation, and like you say, I'm sure we can shoot the breeze on this for many, many more hours to come. But let's wrap it up here. We'll just go around. If you can tell people where they can find you online, if they want to hear more, or find some more of your content online. Let's go the other way around. So we'll start with you, John.
Okay. I am John, the Godless Engineer. I primarily post here on YouTube, and I post content concerning like atheism, as well as religion and politics, where those things meet, as well as Christian origins and history of Christianity. I discuss all those things. I also post a good bit over there on Facebook. I don't know if anybody still uses Facebook, but I post over there, funny memes and stuff. Oh, do you?
Yeah, I love your post, John.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate somebody still does. But every time I post, my follower count goes down. So
yeah.
Haters gonna hate. Haters gonna hate.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you, David?
I'm probably easiest to find on Facebook as well. And you can send me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com. Again, those books are Nailed, Jesus Mything in Action, and Playing God, and they're all for the most part, the Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion series.
Amazing.
Interesting. I think, David, the South African Secular Society in South Africa did a biography on you, if I'm not mistaken, about your writings, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, wow.
I actually came across it in my, exploration of the esteemed gentleman I'll be finding myself in conversation with tonight. But yeah, very, very interesting. So yeah, there's that.
You'll have to send me a link to that.
Sorry?
You'll have to send me a link to that. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah.
For your thesis. Your thesis.
Oh yes, yeah. So everything on me, I mean, you can basically just Google me. I'm everywhere, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, X. That hog bloody. What's the word? I'm there's a specific word, but which I don't want to swear now because that would be unprofessional. But in Afrikaans, the word is a spoelput. I can't remember the English for it now, but anyway, so I'm on X as well. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm basically everywhere. So you just either search my name or you can go and Google the Friendly Satanist. Either one is fine. Googling either is fine.
Amazing. Yeah, and as always, you guys can find us online, follow us, connect with our hosts, with our guests, and keep thinking critically. Be safe over this festive period coming up. If you are an atheist that is feeling left out by all of this Christian tomfoolery around you, seek your community, look for your community online. We as the Atheist Republic in South Africa, we are having a Christmas meet-up where we're all going to go and sit down and sacrifice babies and talk smack about God all afternoon long. So
and cry about evolution in schools.
I know. So find your community, connect with your community. You are not alone. There are many like you who don't buy the bullshit. And take care, my friends. We'll see you again in the new year for more of this. If you like what we do, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention as well in closing quickly. Sorry, Wes is going to kill me if I don't mention them. I would like to thank our patrons. We worship our patrons. We bow down to our patrons. They are the people who make this possible and who keep us afloat. Firstly, Paul Camish, Karen Butcher, Puck, Helen Green, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Rion, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, Sunny Shell, and Phil Calderone. And then also a big shout out to the crew behind the scenes who keep the lights on and makes everything run smoothly. As well as our channel members, we have got Hooligan, Manuel Point, Karen Butcher as well, Ember, A.L. Tucker, and Kelly Laughlin. Thank you. You guys rock. And we'll see you on the flip side.
Dank u wel, Dean.